Hi everyone, Magnus here, this time covering a chess game between the legend himself, Vasyl Ivanchuk, former top-level GM, has, fallen down a little bit as he's gotten older, but then again, I think he's just playing for the love of the game most of the time, playing some very interesting chess and very creative. That's what he is known for. But speaking of creative and inventive chess, he's playing Richard Rapport, top-level super GM. Over the past 2 years, he has some of his experiments have gone a little bit wrong, but this game in particular, the experiment paid off exquisitely, as you are about to see. So, jumping into the game, we have Ivanchuk with the white pieces starting with pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn to c4, and g6. Now, this is either the king's Indian defense, if you were just going to fianchetto castle and play d6, or possibly going for the Grunfeld defense with pawn to d5, which strikes in the center, gives up a center d pawn for the c pawn, but looks to get active pieces and counterplay on the white center. So after knight to c3, we do in fact see this move, pawn to d5, striking in the middle. This is the Grunfeld. Knight to f3. This is a more quiet way to play. A lot of people like to take and then go e4, which is how you get the big center against the Grunfeld, but this can come under fire pretty quick. So Ivanchuk trying to go for a more tame setup. But as you're about to see, this game is not tame in the slightest. Bishop to g7, we see, just developing pretty standard from Rapport. And now in this position, queen to b3 and taking on d5 are the most common ways to play this. But we do see bishop to f4, also a logical approach, trying to play the move e3 without blocking the bishop outside of the pawn chain. So bishop to f4, castles, rook to c1, bringing a rook to the middle of the board. Bishop to g4, attacking the knight. If the pawn goes to e3, now the horse is pinned, and there will be potential play against this pawn, as the horse is a key defender. Pawn to e3 does happen, and this very creative novelty by Rapport. As you can see, his time has not gone down that much on this move. He only spent about a minute, so I assume that this was some home cooking from Rapport. Pawn to c5, fully giving up the pawn just for free. The pawn is captured, but now bishop takes f3, the justification. Queen takes f3 and knight to e4. Any other move here would be way too slow. Simply drop this pawn, white reinforces, knight to e4, critical move, opening up the dark squared bishop here, and with the knight and the bishop prowling on the c3 square, this looks a little bit risky for Ivanchuk, especially as he hasn't castled his king yet. So, takes on d5, does Ivanchuk, gobbles another pawn, says, do your worst, Rapport. And now this knight is hanging, and if you want to take me with the knight, I'll just take with the pawn. Why have you given me 2 pawns? But instead we see bishop takes on c3, pawn takes back, and queen takes on d5. The dark squared bishop has been lost for the black pieces, which does look pretty sad. Bishop pair for Ivanchuk, but there is a justification. By the way, Ivanchuk already down to 36 minutes, as you can see, taking lots of big things. So he's definitely been caught off guard. Rapport very happy, I imagine, with this position. Rook to d1 and queen to e6. Queen e6 is, I'm assuming, still part of Rapport's preparation, although given that he spent 10 minutes, maybe he couldn't exactly remember. Queen to e6, either way, is the move that gets played. Rook to d4, kicking out the knight. Knight takes on c5. And as you can see, the white king is still in the center, but if you just play moves like bishop to c4, which is, in fact, what gets played, the only move for white to stay in the game, it looks like you're about to castle. But then, if you were to castle, there is some unpleasantries with capturing here. Move like knight to c6 attacks the rook. Let's say the rook drops back. And just simple chess here, white is scattered. Look at these pawns, what a mess. You have the bishop pair, but these horses are stacking on top of each other, covering a lot of squares here. Good control. And this doesn't look like a very pleasant endgame for Ivanchuk. So, instead, we see queen to c6, offer an exchange of queens here. If you were to take, the knight jumps in with tempo on the rook, So instead, bishop to d5 looks like a good move, eyeing down this diagonal. But instead of queen to f6, which is the engine recommendation, this move I don't really know. I guess the idea is e5. But instead, we see an interesting move, queen to b5, cutting the king, preventing castles. Queen to b5 is what gets played, and apparently you had to go bishop to h6 here. But then this leads to an instant draw, apparently. I have no idea. This would have gone down a pretty similar line, actually, to what we see in the game, but absolute chaos here. I think this might still be something the Rapport was somewhat familiar with, at least this idea. You go for all these tricks. However, instead of seeing the critical move bishop to h6, we instead see pawn to a4. Ivanchuk just wants to kick the queen, say to a6, play bishop to c4, castle the king, and he wants to get home scot-free. But we see knight to d3, and here is where the magic starts. King goes to d2 and queen b2. The king is getting dragged out of the bed and onto the street, ready for a beating. King takes on d3. The horse is just completely sacrificed. And now this very nice move, knight to a6. Not knight to c6, because then you simply capture, but the move knight to a6, trying to access the c5 square. Knight goes to a6, rook goes to c4, preventing knight to c5, but now the rook comes to the center, eyeing down, prepping e6, all kinds of threats here. It's looking pretty dangerous. No way back for the king. The black queen cuts all of these retreat squares, and if the king ventures further to try and get out, well, this just looks awful. Apparently, you can just simply snap here, and the king would basically be checkmated in the middle of the board with something like queen c2, I guess. And there are no more squares for the king. This isn't exactly what happened, though. Instead, after this move, we see bishop goes to e5, and Ivanchuk wants to put the bishop back here, maybe, and try and get his queen to team up and go for a little checkmate. The only move was bishop to h6, but after e6, this still looks very, very scary and not a very good position for white. Also, Ivanchuk, with only 6 minutes left on the clock, is highly, highly dangerous. Instead, bishop goes to e5, pawn to e6 played, and I guess the idea behind bishop to e5 was that after pawn e6, there is queen to f6. However, if you want to try and give it a go yourself, there is a winning 2-move combination here from Rapport that simply ends the game on the spot, and that move is after queen goes to f6, threatening the mate. There's only one good idea, and that is rook takes on d5 check, and after king e4, rook takes e5 with a check. Brilliant move given by the engine, attacking the king. And if you take with the king, apparently there's pawn b5, which just looks, I guess pawn b5 makes sense, because if you take, then you hit the rook, and that's a fork. But if you don't take and you go queen d4, I'm not exactly sure what the engine's giving after rook d4. It's giving knight c7. Okay, I guess the king is just super weak. The king looks ridiculous here on the e5 square, but we don't see that. Oops. Oh no, what have I done? No, I ruined it, guys. Okay. Queen to f6, we see rook takes on d5. Rook takes on e5. The mad rook has been unleashed. And after the king takes, Rapport actually goes queen to e2 rather than this weird b5 move. Makes a lot more sense. Hits the rook from over here. And after the rook goes to d4, which I'm assuming happens, he finds this extremely classy move, knight back to b8. The only move to keep black in the advantage. Threatening the move knight to c6, and it's basically unstoppable. You can't do a whole lot about it. If you try and bring your king back, there's even the move e5. Absolutely lovely move. And if the queen captures, there's knight c6, drawing either the queen or the king back onto the square where it's a c6 fork. And alternatively, if you try and move your rook somewhere, boom, check, hits the rook, hits the king. And now what happens is that the king has to take the pawn to stay in contact, but then there's just rook e8. And that's game over. Nowhere really to go. Queen e7 takes, king f6. There's probably a checkmate here. Queen h4, rook here. Knight e7 even. A rook e6 is mate in 1. Oh yeah, That makes a lot more sense. So this could have happened, but it didn't. After knight to b8, we see rook d7, queen goes to c4. This is just such a motif of this game. The queen cuts all the king's retreat squares, so the king has nowhere to run. The pawns are covering. The king is boxed in, and knight to c6 is a huge threat. Queen goes to f4, but on the same time, Ivanchuk simply resigns the game. He, in fact, he didn't reach time control. He didn't resign either. I think he just flagged. I guess that's what happened because it looks like the extra time was added, but it's only moved 26. A miniature played by Richard Rapport. Very nice game. The reason why queen f4 doesn't work is because pawn to f6 and you have to give up the queen, and that is no bueno. So very nice game. Very nice game by Rapport, taking down a legend like Ivanchuk in such style. I do hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please do consider liking and subscribing. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.